I think we're ready to begin. A warm welcome to all of you in our audience, and thank you for joining us tonight. We have an excellent group of more than 300 people signed up from universities and colleges, from private sector, from government, from all different walks of life, but many universities are represented. From around the United States, from around China, and an interesting mix of other countries from Canada to Kazakhstan. So my name is Madeline Ross. I'm the president of the U.S. China Education Trust, which has worked for about 2 decades to bring educational programs and exchanges to people in the United States and China to help them better understand each other. We are very excited to join tonight with the Carter Center and the U.S. Heartland China Association to bring you this program on trends and challenges facing Chinese students and scholars in the United States, a subject of great importance to all of us. I'll be moderating tonight and begin now with an outline of the program. First, we're very happy to have former Missouri Governor Bob Holden, who now chairs the U.S. Heartland China Association, who in a minute will set the stage with a brief welcome. He will be followed by Karen Fisher, a senior writer at the Chronicle for Higher Education, who has for many years covered international education and China. Her reporting really sets the pace on these topics, and she's been featured in a lot of national media. I suspect she is not unfamiliar to many of you in the audience. You can find more about all the speakers that we have tonight in registration materials, and we'll also put a link up in the chat. There it is now. So you can refer to that for more detail. I'll be returning after Karen Fisher speaks to introduce our other panelists and start the discussion. But first, it's my distinct honor now to turn the program over to you, Governor Holden.
Well, thank you very much, Madeline. I'm delighted to join everyone at this very special event today. As a former governor of Missouri, I opened Missouri's first China office. I knew then how important China students were to our state universities, intellectually and economically. After leaving office, I taught at Webster University for 10 years. I helped bring the first Confucius Institute to our state. I had many Chinese students taking my classes. I came to appreciate their curiosity and courage pursuing an international education here in the U.S. Now, as chairman and CEO of the United States Heartland China Association, we believe that educational exchanges between our two countries are key to building a productive U.S.-China relationship. We have organized many programs to support Chinese students in the past 2+ years, and I'm pleased that we have come together to bring more attention to this very important topic. I was educated in a one-room schoolhouse in rural Missouri. Had it not been for the many teachers and mentors who opened the doors for me, I wouldn't be where I am today. Chinese students are a great asset to America and China and our world at large. I hope we will work hard to keep opening doors for Chinese students to come study here. Now, let's hear from the impressive lineup of experts, starting with Karen Fisher of the Chronicle for Higher Education.
Well, thank you, Governor. Thanks, Madeline. I'm happy to be here with you today. I'm always quite excited to talk about Chinese students in the U.S., one of my favorite topics. But I would also say we are at a particularly important moment to be having the conversation we're having tonight. As I'm sure just about everyone here knows, the last number of years, Chinese students have really been a phenomenon. The number of Chinese students coming to the U.S. is really unprecedented in international student mobility. in the dozen years prior to the pandemic, Chinese students increased at American colleges by 450%. So at their height, there were more than 375,000. They accounted for 1 in every 3 international students in the United States. Today's picture looks a little bit different. As of May 2022, according to statistics from Study in the States, so Department of Homeland Security, Department of State, there were 30% fewer Chinese students in the US than just prior to the pandemic. But perhaps even more important, I think, is to look at the visa applications, to look at what's happening and what's going to be the picture of Chinese students in the US for the next several years. And for people who really, like the governor, support international exchange and mobility, I think these numbers are a little troubling. If you look at May through July numbers, May through August are the most important time, because most students need to get to apply for their visas quite close to when they are coming to study in the United States. So for May through August, or May through July, rather, we don't yet have August numbers publicly. There were about 43,000 visas given to Chinese students. Now, that sounds like a big number, but it's 45% fewer than in the same 3 months in 2019. So the comparable period just before the pandemic. And Madeline asked me, could I put that in some context? So I looked at what was going on in India, which is the number 2 sending country behind China. Visas from India in the same period, so May through July, are up 132% over just prior to the pandemic. 69,000 visas have been issued to Indian students. Now, we don't have the August numbers, so we can't say anything definitively. But if this is the case, then at least in terms of new students, India could leapfrog China. So what does that say about students in the pipeline? Because I think if you'd asked me, I would have, prior to just looking the last few months, I would have warned you, I would have cautioned to say, don't pay too much attention to what is happening right as we come out of the pandemic, which hopefully we are. Because the thing is, Chinese students and their families, they don't impulsively decide to study abroad or to study in America. In general, it is something that they plan for, that they save for a very long time, for multiple years, that they are, many of them, opting out of the national curriculum and going to programs that prepare them to study abroad. And that's an irrevocable decision. And so I would say the students who are applying and coming for visas right now to come to study, or who are coming to study, are here probably in the fall of 2020, they made their choices before the start of the pandemic. And so it's important to wonder, and one of the things I think will be very interesting to see in the next few years is, what do those numbers look like for those students who had to make their choices during the height of the pandemic? The other thing I think it tells us is the pandemic wasn't the only thing going on, and it can't be what's explaining today's trends in Chinese students. And I'm going to return to that in a second, but I will say that, although I've just sort of downplayed the pandemic, there are ways in which the pandemic affected Chinese students that was different than other international students. For one, the travel ban on Chinese students, on Chinese nationals in general, and travel from China, it was instituted in the very earliest days of the pandemic. It ran until May 2021. And while Chinese students could come to the US, it was very difficult. They had to transit and quarantine in a third country. At the same time, consulates, visa processing had pretty much ground to a halt. That returned in May 2021, but it was slow to reopen. And certainly there have been some hiccups with visa processing. Now, that is not unique to China. I've heard that all over the country, all over the world, and it's quite natural, I think, given that everything was shut down for so long. But I think that is a factor. I also think one thing that makes China stand out is the continued lockdowns and continued travel issues. That's not the case most anywhere else in the world right now. And while I've been focusing largely on enrollment trends and mobility, I think it's important to acknowledge the ways in which that has had an enormous stress on students who were already here at the start of the pandemic. And I think we'll hear a lot about that from the college representatives. But I mean, many of these students stayed in the US, continued throughout the pandemic, and they were cut off from their family and their support networks. They didn't get to go home. For the students who went home, they were suddenly studying remotely, asynchronously, or in the middle of the night. And so I think we're going to probably see in the long term some really impact on learning outcomes and on mental health. And we can't even really begin to understand entirely what that is. And then the other thing I think that sadly we have to acknowledge out of the pandemic is the rise in anti-Asian and anti-Chinese specifically sentiment in the United States. Stop AAPI Hate, the group has cataloged 150,000 incidents of anti-Asian discrimination through March of this year. When I talk to Chinese students, which I do quite a lot, it is remarkably different. And the ways in which they have internalized that it stresses them, that it scares them even, it's really quite troubling. That said, I think we have to acknowledge there are other factors. A big one is obviously that we're brewing before the pandemic. A big one obviously is was the political environment. The Trump administration certainly made anti-Chinese policy a big part of its administration. And that did touch higher education. It did touch international students. There were a few policies that specifically focused on Chinese students, limiting the duration that certain graduate students could have on their visas, and Proclamation 10043, which said that people who graduated as undergraduates from Chinese universities believed to be affiliated with the national security or military apparatus in China could not get visas. That has affected, estimates suggest, maybe about 5,000 students. So all in all, not a huge number of students directly affected, but I would say that there is some trickle down impact, that there is some sort of messaging and internalizing that's made, I think, even though these policies don't affect the majority of students, made students concerned about the policies. I would also say one of the things, particularly during the Trump administration, that you cannot discount is the ways in which the fear of policies, rumors of policies affected students. And so, when you hear about leaks from the White House that the administration was considering banning all Chinese students, I mean, that also, I think, has been problematic. And then more broadly, you have things like the China Initiative, not really focused on students, but the government investigation of academic and economic espionage with China. I think that's just added to the climate. Obviously, we're 2 years into a new administration. The Biden administration has taken a number of steps. It's ended the China Initiative, although I think we have some questions about practically what that's going to mean. It's also, the administration has also released a joint statement on international education, very supportive of international students generally. On the other hand, there are some things that people have been hoping they would do, like ending Proclamation 10043. And in fact, there's a lawsuit to try to get the administration to reverse that executive order. But I think when we talk about the political environment, we can't just think about what's going on in Washington, D.C. We have to think about the ways that it's sort of affected things more broadly in American sentiment. And I think it's fair to say some of that anti-Chinese sentiment is kind of, unfortunately, metastasized more broadly. Last year, Pew Research Center did a survey, and it found that more than half of Americans, 55%, favor limiting Chinese students specifically in the United States. That's having an effect on students. It's also having an effect more broadly on Sino-American partnerships, which we can talk about later. Let me say very quickly, I do think the political environment also cuts both ways, and there are things that are happening in China that are also affecting things. It's always been kind of this delicate equilibrium when it comes to Chinese students studying in America. On one hand, you had, Xi Jinping's daughter studying at Harvard. On the other hand, he's regularly talking about, the danger of Western ideas. And so at what point does that balance not hold? And will we see policies specifically that affect the ability of Chinese students to come to the US? You also see tightening within the Chinese higher education system, concerns about what you can research, political or teachings in the classrooms, feelings of surveillance. To what extent are those affecting Chinese students who are here? We've certainly seen incidences where we've had Chinese student scholar associations protest against speakers whose perspectives they disagree with. We've had students penalized for speech, for social media postings that they made here when they returned to China. And so to what extent are we seeing the environment in China, the politics there coming into the American classroom? What does that mean for Chinese students? And more broadly, also, what does that mean for American higher education? There are a number of other factors that we can talk about later, everything from return on investment to increased global competition that are also at play in the environment for Chinese students in the United States. But right now, I'll turn it back to Madeline and the panel. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Karen. That was a great up-to-the-minute overview of the numbers and also a summary of what's really been a perfect storm of events that have affected Chinese students in America for the past few years, starting with the tensions in U.S. China relations, the policies of the Trump administration, and the unbelievable disruptions of the pandemic. I think we are all holding our breath and hoping that we've turned a corner and are going to enter a more stable period for our educational relations with China. The Carter Center published a report I'd just like to mention earlier this year on the importance of higher education in U.S. China relations, and it was called Finding Firmer Ground. If we could put up a link in the chat to that. Also, going forward, I want to mention that the U.S. China Education Trust is launching a project to look at the changing profile of Chinese students in America over the past several decades. This is going to include a survey of Chinese alumni from U.S. schools over a number of years, followed by a series of public events that will give current and former Chinese students a chance to share their stories. So stay tuned. Tonight, however, our focus is really on the current academic year for the most part, and where we're going around the country at different schools. While U.S. China relations have decidedly not improved in recent months, American campuses, on the other hand, are their conditions are improving and they're getting back to more normal operations. They're welcoming international students in large numbers again. To understand what's happening on the ground, we have invited 4 campus representatives tonight to bring their perspectives as professors, as senior administrators, or both. You have their bios, so I'm just going to mention a few highlights about them. First, we're going to hear from Yingyi Ma from Syracuse University, a professor of sociology and a well-known expert on Chinese college students in America. Her highly regarded book on the successes and struggles of Chinese students in America was published in 2020. Next, we'll hear from Frank Neville, Senior Vice President at Georgia Institute of Technology. Frank has deep university experience, but he also brings a background of previous work as a diplomat in the State Department, where he had postings that included Taipei, Chengdu, and Beijing. Samantha McCabe will next draw on her long experience with international students and her current position as the head of the Office of International Students at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. More than half of the international students at Madison are from mainland China. Then, at the end, we will finish our journey from East to West Coast with Yong Chen, Professor of History and an Associate Dean at the University of California, Irvine. He's worked on with international students, and his research and writing has covered Chinese food, culture, and education exchanges. After these remarks, we will return as a group for a group discussion. Feel free to submit your questions at any time using the chat function. And let's begin with Professor Ma at Syracuse University.
Thank you very much, Madeline. It's my great honor and pleasure to speak to you today. And just as Madeline mentioned, I published a book 2 years ago with Columbia University Press focusing on Chinese international students as undergraduate at American higher education. So my research is really based on a mixed method study, both survey of over 50 university and liberal arts colleges, as well as a selected sample of in-depth interviews. And I was really motivated, as Karen speak, over the past decade, a skyrocketing growth before the pandemic of a wave of undergraduate students in American higher education. And I started the research in 2012. And by 2014, Chinese undergraduate students has for the first time ever surpassed Chinese graduate students and becoming the majority of Chinese international students population in American higher education. I presume after pandemic, the pattern is still the same because, as Karen said, Chinese international students have experienced a general decline, but the graduate students, the decline of graduate students is even more prominent, especially in STEM fields, pretty much as a targeted policy especially by the Trump administration, than undergraduate students. So undergraduate students still the majority of of Chinese international students population in the United States. So I just wanna share with you some of the policy implications that I draw from my research for undergraduate students for the first part, and then I'm going to talk about the graduate students, especially what the challenges they have faced post-pandemic after COVID-19 hit. So for my research on undergraduate students, I focus on the academic and social experiences and challenges they have faced in American higher education. Some of the issues are pretty similar before the pandemic and after the pandemic. For example, the lack of social integration that Chinese students have felt, especially at undergraduate level, because undergraduate students are living supposedly a more integrated life. They have taken similar courses. There's liberal arts core requirement, unlike graduate students who are oftentimes more specialized. But they have this, my research has found that they have this very much involuntary self-segregation. So in other words, there is a strong desire among them to venture out of their own group, but there is seems to be a strong institutional and cultural barrier. So I have suggested that educational institutions, especially American higher education, should not take the sink or swim approach. They should take a more proactive approach and provide more structured networking opportunities for Chinese students. The seemingly voluntary self-segregation by many Chinese students in America, although protective, I was actually talking about the potentially cushioning effect and supportive environment provided by their own community, is in fact involuntary, the self-segregation, and deeply unsatisfying to both Chinese and American students. Because for some of the students, one of the motivations they come here is to seek so-called cosmopolitan cultural capital. And a part of that, to acquire that kind of cultural capital, is to make diverse friends, including American friends. So I suggest that American institutions need to provide structured platforms to mix Chinese American students for optimal global learning for all. They need to make intentional effort to encourage Chinese students to join campus organizations that my research has found make positive effects in terms of encouraging more of a social integration, and engage in campus activities that promote social integration. So in my book, I specifically mentioned the examples taken by University of Illinois Football 101 camp, benefiting Chinese students through the social glue of campus sports, and other universities such as Temple University and Indiana Bloomington have followed suit by hiring Chinese students as sportscasters speaking Mandarin for American football and basketball games, so that to get Chinese students out of their own social bubble and stimulating interactions between Chinese American students. In terms of academic experiences, I had some concrete suggestions for American faculty, people like, us professors, in terms of how to really effectively teach and interact in classrooms with Chinese students. And my research has found that a lot of American professors feel unprepared and sometimes feel that they also need training and support. So I suggest that such support could include seminars and forums on peer mentoring offered by faculty with existing experiences in China who could enhance instructors' understanding of the country and Chinese students. And those activities need to be resourced and rewarded by the institutions to participating faculty. So in terms of classroom participations and trying to encourage Chinese students to speak up more in classroom discussions, I encourage American faculty to facilitate more small group discussions, assigning team members rather than let students form their own groups to maximize the opportunities for students to having various access to different, potentially making different connections. So finally, I also make suggestions to career services that American university career services are very much domestic students oriented, and they should advise them and advocating on their behalf for more post-graduation opportunities in the United States. So the recent policy change by the Biden administration expanding the list of STEM fields that are eligible for 3-year OPT optional practical training is a welcome one. But I would really advocate that we should also allow non-STEM students to have the similar kinds of policy and in terms of OPT duration. This differential treatment between STEM graduates and non-STEM graduates in terms of their access to opportunities to work in the United States actually inadvertently driven many Chinese students to major in STEM fields. Instead of majoring in fields like sociology or political science, okay? So overall, my conclusion is American is strong because it can attract a talent. And Chinese international students are a critical part of that talent pool. Nowhere is more evident than graduate students, especially in STEM fields. That is currently, I can see that my home institution undergoing tremendous amount of decline that not only influence graduate students, but also influencing faculty research. I've heard from multiple colleagues that they could not really recruit the best and brightest as they used to be, that their research are negatively impacted. Therefore, very much, I would really encourage the policymakers, the politicians, anybody who can influence at that level to really advocate for the change of policy to support our graduate students. I would say in the current era of polarizing narratives that pit America against China, Chinese international students may be one of the rare cases that do see the Chinese and American interests converge rather than diverge. That is to say, there is this still strong education desire and incentive for Chinese students to receive American credentials. And many of them, particularly in STEM fields, actually stay after graduation to contribute to American science and technology, which benefit the American national competitiveness. Thank you.
Thank you, Yingyi. Frank, you may begin.
Thank you very much. I think the presentation we just heard is a perfect segue for what I'm about to say. Georgia Tech really prides itself on global connectivity. Believes that global connectivity is a key to our institutional success and vibrancy. It's a key pillar of our strategic plan. And when we go out in the community and we talk about our value to Atlanta, to Georgia, to the United States, we talk about the things that we just heard about in terms of being magnet for talent and a source of talent, which then drives innovation and propels economic growth on a local level here in Georgia, but also on a national level. So we're firmly committed to that. We're, unabashedly proud of it, and we try to make sure that we're walking that talk every day as well. And this is a commitment that for us starts at the top. You heard from Madeline about my background as a diplomat and my time in China, but my boss, the president, is from Spain. He himself was a Fulbright exchange student and got his PhD from Georgia Tech through an international education program that changed his life. And he's also written a book on being global and the importance of being global. So for us, this is really sort of a core mission. It's not something that is a nice supplement or complement. It's very core to us. And Georgia Tech, fortunately, also has a very, very long history of engagement, international engagement with China. Obviously, this predates me a bit, but beginning in 1995 and true through the present day, Chinese students have been the largest international student group on a Georgia Tech campus. In 1995, they totaled a little under 200. This year, we have over 3,000, over 3,100. Interestingly, and this is, I guess we're a little bit abnormal in this. I didn't even realize that until I listened to the previous presentation, but our Chinese student population is roughly 2/3 graduate student and maybe 1/3 undergraduate student. Now, undergraduate students have had a little bit more difficult time coming to Georgia Tech in the past year, because we required standardized tests for the undergraduate program. It's been a little hard to take a standardized test in China. So we've seen our undergraduate applications from China slip a little bit from about 1,500 per year before the pandemic to about 1,000 in this most current cycle. But again, we still have a large Chinese student population. Interestingly, it peaked during the pandemic. We actually had around 3,800 students, Chinese students enrolled last year. Again, we're down a bit on that, which again, we've seen the decline in the undergraduate due to our view is the testing difficulties, but still, again, a very, very large number of students. In addition to the Chinese students that we host on campus and that participate in our undergraduate and graduate programs, we also have a very strong study abroad program. I think about 60% of our undergraduate students participate in study abroad. And those numbers obviously went down during the pandemic. We had to cancel lots of programs and bring students home, as many of you also probably had to do. But we've started to resume those programs, and again, we're looking actually at ways of expanding our footprint for study abroad programs. And we're fortunate that we also have a dedicated campus in Shenzhen. We have joint programs with Tianjin University. And those programs have been run for a number of years, but a few years ago, at the request of the Shenzhen government, we decided to relocate them to Shenzhen. The Shenzhen authorities are in the process of building a campus for our joint programs. We have about 5 master's programs. Actually, not about 5. We have exactly 5 master's programs that we run from our Shenzhen location. We have about 300 students enrolled in those programs. And interestingly, for the fall, it must have been the fall of 2020 when international travel was so difficult. One thing we did was we used our international campuses, the one in Shenzhen, and then we have another one in France, to take in students who weren't able to get into the United States because of the pandemic. So I can't remember how many we had in France, but we had several hundred students, mostly Chinese national students, who couldn't get into the United States physically, but wanted to have a in-person learning experience, and so they did that at our campus in Shenzhen. So we have been blessed with an international footprint that has allowed us to improve our connectivity, improve our service for Chinese students, and then also to be a destination for a number of American students studying abroad there in Shenzhen. So happy to answer any questions or talk about any of these topics that have been raised or that haven't been raised, but people are interested in discussing.
Thank you. Now we'll turn it over to Samantha.
Great, thank you so much for inviting me to be part of this panel tonight. So I am coming to you from the University of Wisconsin-Madison here in Wisconsin, in the Midwest, where we at UW-Madison have a very rich history of teaching, learning, and research exchange with China and Chinese universities since the early 1900s. And that certainly does continue into present day. In May of 2019, a couple of my colleagues had the pleasure of traveling throughout China with our chancellor at the time, previous Chancellor Rebecca Blank, who actually had signed officially an agreement with Nanjing University during that visit. A lot of excitement came out of that, a lot of great connections, not only with prospective and current students, as well as our alumni and active alumni chapters there, but also with parents and families. And then fast forward to January of 2020, and that's when COVID really hit. We had students who had returned home for Lunar New Year celebrations, and it was at that point that our university and my office specifically began the strong advocacy work with our campus administrators and leadership to quickly begin making plans to accommodate students in online learning forums, not knowing the extent to which COVID-19 was going to become the true global pandemic that we have lived through and are still living through. Hopefully, as Karen said, we're kind of coming to the end of its extreme impact on higher education. But when that hit us in spring of 2020, we saw our agreement with Nanjing start becoming very fruitful. Almost immediately, we began a PPE exchange of personal protective equipment and gear. They were sending us materials when we didn't have them, and when they didn't have them and our infrastructure was set up, we were sending materials that way. So the May 2019 visit did not go to waste because of COVID, but actually COVID began strengthening our ties even more, to the point where parents praised our chancellor at the time for not sending all students home. All of our international students, especially our Chinese students, being our largest international student population on campus, had a home in Madison, and we made every attempt to make sure that we were providing the learning and living support resources that our students needed to remain in the U.S. and on our campus. However, COVID was not without its challenges. While that was a small win to get that praise from those Chinese parents, we saw tremendous challenges and overcame some tremendous hurdles, many of which actually still continue today, and I think are going to continue to shape the future of U.S. higher education, as well as global mobility for U.S. education moving forward. Some of those challenges, definitely, thinking about the individual student, online learning is not for everyone, but it is especially not for everyone when you are in a different time zone than the rest of your classmates and from your instructors. And that was a major difficulty for especially our students in China, waking up in the middle of the night to log into a Zoom class where it's midday here for their US peers, or even their international student peers who were able to remain in the US. I think another important point that online learning and the online research and continual on-campus employment that we were continuing to allow throughout COVID, it also highlighted some financial inequities for students, the expensive access to good VPN, letting instructors know that not all technology tools or educational tools that they were using in their classrooms were easily accessible in China, such as YouTube or Google Suite. We also, for a period of time, were definitely worried about, the degree recognition for the degrees that students were earning if it was their final semester, and they were completing those programs completely online. And then, of course, that definitely had an impact then on our students' life plans. In the US, there are certain immigration policies on post-completion employment authorizations, such as OPT, and students who were essentially stranded outside the US and unable to return lost years of planning and work that they were working towards. To then have to shift very quickly in a global economy that was slowed to a halt because of the pandemic is even more disastrous in those individual student plans. The visa acquisition and student mobility, the rapid shift of everything, as Karen was alluding to, with the consular closures, the slow restarts, we're still seeing some of those impacts. The very expensive flights that students have had to make the difficult decision to purchase or not, sometimes compromising their legal US immigration status because a flight was so unaffordable, or because they only had the option to travel to one of 6 cities within the US to have their COVID tests within a timely manner, and to board a direct flight back home. So some of those challenges certainly still persist for many of our Chinese students, and they've had to very quickly shift their life plans once again when they may have been planning to return home or go elsewhere for employment, but are now, turning back inwards into the US, into a difficult job market for international students, especially those not in STEM fields. For those in STEM fields, however, the Presidential Proclamation 10043, the military civil fusion strategy in China is the primary driver of that presidential proclamation, which essentially suspends entry and visa acquisition. I'm sorry, that's my cat. Visa acquisition for Chinese graduate students and researchers in STEM fields based on certain connections that they are suspected to have had. Sometimes the proof is very difficult to find, and that's what makes it difficult to advise our Chinese graduate students and our researchers on the presidential proclamation, which, as Karen mentioned, is still in place in a carryover from the Trump administration. So that does continue to be a challenge. And while the numbers of impacted graduate students may be small, 3,000 to 5,000 are some of the figures that I've seen, and I know the numbers are quite small compared to our large international or our large Chinese student population on campus. I think it's the hidden numbers. It's the numbers of the students that haven't reported because they haven't tried, because they don't want to get denied. And I think that is going to continue to have a long-term impact on our graduate student recruitment and admissions. As Yingyi mentioned, our campus definitely does follow that trend of we do have more Chinese undergraduates than graduate students in recent years. And I think that this presidential proclamation is going to continue to have this impact, even if it is, repealed. It was out there, and that feeling of unwelcomeness is still out there. It's also impacting the research and teaching missions of institutions like mine. As a research intense institution, these graduate students are also our teaching assistants. They are our research assistants. They play a pivotal role in our teaching and research mission of our institution, and we could not do the work that we do, especially in undergraduate teaching and learning, if we don't have those highly skilled and highly educated graduate students working as teaching assistants, project assistants, or in our labs as research assistants. And the last thing I just want to mention, because I would be remiss if I didn't acknowledge, my disdain for the continued anti-Asian sentiment throughout the US that is happening on our college campuses and in the communities in which our colleges and universities are situated, my own included. And there is a lot of work that our campuses can and should be doing in concert with our Asian Pacific Islander and Asian populations and organizations on campus to really take a stand against the hate, bias, and violent acts of aggression towards our Asian and Asian American students. And one thing that my campus is doing is we are partnering with our university police department, our Madison City Police Department, as well as our Dean of Students Office, to host a forum for our students, current and prospective, as well as their parents and families, to learn about campus and community safety and what our police departments are doing to combat these acts of hate and physical violence against all populations, but especially our Asian and Asian American student populations. So I'll end there, and I want to pass it off to my last colleague and our last panelist, Yang Chen. Thank you.
Greetings from Irvine, Southern California, everyone. First of all, I would like to thank the U.S. China Education Trust, the Carter Center, and the U.S. Heartland China Association for organizing this important panel. I would also like to thank those on the panel and everyone in the audience for their good work and their support for students from China. I'm a historian, so what I'll do in the first half of my talk, of my remarks, is to put today's presence of Chinese students in a historical context. And if there's time in the second half of my remarks, I will discuss some issues and facts about Chinese students at the University of California, Irvine. So the first point that I want to make is that the internationalization of education, especially higher education, has been a global trend, as we all know. And as we also all know, the US is a dominant player, reflecting its global post-war global dominance. For example, in the academic year of 1949 to 1950, there were just slightly over 26,000 international students in the entire US. But in the during the 2019-2020 academic year, there were over 1 million international students enrolled in U.S. colleges and universities, representing just under 5% of the total U.S. Student population. International students, including students from China, they find the American education system attractive, not because of what they can learn here. It is also because of the opportunities in the US that would become accessible to them when they become a student in the US. In fact, after 1965, studying in American universities and colleges has become an increasingly important vehicle for people to immigrate to the US. The second point that I want to make is that education has been a very significant part of America's relationship with other countries. In the case of China, trade and education, including education exchange, have been perhaps the two most important and the two longest lasting aspects in the bilateral relationship between the two countries. Merchants were the first Americans to arrive in China, which started with the voyage of the Empress of China from New York to Canton in 1784. They were followed by the missionaries, which arrived in the early 1830s. And much of the work of the American missionaries was in the realm of education. The desire, as we can see very clearly, the desire of Americans to educate Chinese youth started from missionaries. It actually has started even before the missionaries arrived in China. The American Board of Foreign Commissioners established the first foreign mission school in Cornwall, Connecticut, marking the beginning of its missionary work among non-Anglo-Americans. So from 1817 to 1926, about 100 students attended the school, speaking 24 different languages, and 5 of them were students from China. All of them. One of them eventually became the translator for Lin Zhexu. And so this trend continued. When China and the U.S. resumed diplomatic ties in the late 1970s, education exchange was among the first to be resumed. So China sent its first batch of students to the U.S. towards the end of in December of 78, just 10 days after the two countries announced that they were going to resume diplomatic relations. By the way, the idea came from American officials who suggested to the Chinese authorities, hey, why don't we resume the education exchange by sending students, Chinese students, to the U.S. Third point that I want to make, it's a very brief one. That is the study abroad movement has been a vital part of modern Chinese history. It has been has remained very important to this day. Most American educated students return to China. This is especially true in the 19th century and during the first half of the 20th. And they played an important role in the development of China, its economy, its social educational infrastructure, and also in reinforcing ties between US and China. Fourth point, the volume of students that our country in what we used to call the third world sends overseas often reflects the economic development of a particular country, and this is particularly evident in the case of China. I was an international student, a student from China back in the 1980s. I went to Cornell University in upstate New York back in 19, I'm not that old, in 1985. At the time, a lot of most of the students pursued advanced degrees in STEM fields, Okay, such as math, physics, biological sciences, and so on and so forth. Okay, and the number was very limited. There were just a few hundred of us for multiple years, and we depended for the most part on the funding from the university. Right, so a lot of us worked either as a teaching assistants and or as research assistants. Some of us received funding from the Chinese government, and most very few Chinese families could afford to send their children to the U.S. So very few undergraduate, or almost none undergraduate students. But as the Chinese economy took off, which became, according to some experts, most visible in 2008, a lot of people in a lot of families, more and more families could afford to send their children to the U.S. So in the 2009 and 10 academic year, almost 130,000 Chinese students came to study in the U.S., making China the largest source of international students in America. Okay. And so the trends that I just talked about, okay, are also reflected in what is going on locally at the University of California at Irvine. Okay. So UC Irvine is perhaps the largest public university system in the country. The UC system is one of the 3 higher education systems in the state of California, and UC Irvine is one of the 10 general campuses within the UC system. Okay, and we are also a fairly young institution. UC Irvine was founded in 1965. Okay, we are young but fast-growing university, fast-growing in terms of our reputation, our research excellence, but also in terms of the number of international students. I should say that the presence of international students on the UCI campus was a fairly recent phenomenon. Back in 2008, we had only 231 students from China on the entire campus, and in 2017 we had more than 4,000 students from China. Okay, so like the rest of the nation, this tremendous, extraordinary fast growth in the number of Chinese students is a fairly recent phenomenon. Okay. And students are younger. A majority of them, as Dr. Ma said earlier, a majority of them now are undergraduate students. Okay, and they are spread in more fields than before, than in the past, I said, than they did in the 1980s and 1990s. But they still tend to concentrate in certain areas, such as econ, business, mathematics, international studies, computer sciences, and so on, and so forth. Okay, so what we have realized is, by talking to students, to faculty, is that they face a number of challenges. Economically, they have far more resources than my generation did back in the 1980s and 90s. But there are still challenges, right? Which include language and cultural barriers. Okay, as a reflection of the language barrier, we looked at the performance of international students, mostly Chinese. Okay, a majority of our international students are students from China. Okay, we look at their performances in the classes in different areas, right? And I have seen compelling evidence showing that many of them do not perform as well as domestic students in classes on topics like U.S. history and writing, but they do well in other subjects in STEM fields. Okay, and many of them find it difficult to integrate into student life and campus life for a variety of reasons. Dr. Ma looked into this issue in great depth. Right? But for whatever reason, that is one of the challenges that they face. And in spite of their growing size on the UCI campus and across the nation, I would say they tend to remain invisible, right? And they also tend to, they are, I think, also in a lot of ways, very vulnerable, right? I say that the undergrad students are more so than the graduate students. When you think of graduate students, they have closer relationships with their colleagues in their lab, in the research team, and with their faculty. If they work as a TA in the teaching assistant in the UC system, they also have the protection of the union, right? But so those are some of the reasons why I think undergraduate students are even more vulnerable. And another challenge is that for quite some time, there were on the UCI campus, and I think beyond, negative perceptions about students from China, right? People. Some people thought they all drove fancy cars, or they tend to cheat in exams or on their homework, right? So in response to those issues and challenges, UC Irvine, the whole community, the campus leadership, colleagues from across the campus in different schools, and staff colleagues, we work together to try to address these issues. Right? We formed.
Excuse me, Professor Chen. Could you just begin to wrap up, because we're going to be cutting into our question and answer discussion.
So let me just end this point by saying that we did a host of programs and the events across the campus to help our international students. And I also want to say that we continue to welcome international students from China and also from other countries, right? And we also continue to have educational collaboration with Chinese universities. Okay, let me just conclude by saying that I find this panel important because international students overall, but students from China in particular, they need our support. They need your support. They are politically vulnerable under normal circumstances. When political tension rises, they become even more so. We need to remember the importance of Chinese students. The presence of Chinese students in the US nationally and at the UC Irvine campus locally are an important chapter in the long history of the interactions between the US and China. The presence and well-being of Chinese students in the US are also about the future, including the future of US-China relations. The desire to educate the younger generation of China originated from Americans. It is a desire that has been shared by millions of Americans, and study abroad has become an increasingly integral part of higher education for Americans as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Chen. I'm going to jump right into questions because we have a lot. And I have a few questions myself, which I may have to limit, but let's go. Let me start with Yingy, and I'm just going to direct this to you, but I hope everybody else will jump in too. You have done a lot of work on and mentioned some specific things that universities can do to better integrate Chinese students on the campus. This has sort of been a long-running issue that Chinese students have faced, of social isolation, whether self-imposed or not. So you mentioned the football, the Mandarin announcers for football games. I thought that was really interesting. You mentioned several other things. I was wondering if you have any experience on what's working, whether at your campus or other campuses. Other people should chime in. And one specific thing I wondered is, are there any efforts, are there any bonds that form between Chinese American students and Chinese students? When I was at George Mason, we did a lot of establishing student mentoring programs, and that was one thing that was quite successful.
Great, Madeline. This is a very important question. I also noticed that some people ask similar questions in Q&A, especially pointing out there is some possibility that very widely perceived among the Americans that some of the Chinese students simply don't care. They don't really want to integrate. They're very happy to, or even they even exert peer pressure against those who want to venture out. So how to really sort of reconcile different observations and patterns. And from my findings that there is such a big desire, strong desire that they want to venture out. And I have to say that Chinese students population is diverse. So the diversity is also manifested in terms of their different desires of integrate or venture out or just stay in their comfort zone. So my point is, for those Chinese international students who do want to venture out, our university should provide enough support for them to be able to do so. And my finding shows that the reality is that we have not really been able to provide support for those of the students who do want to venture out, okay? So in terms of, Madeline, your question in terms of the successful programs on campus, I personally have run, before the pandemic, I'm also wearing the hat of Director of Asian American Studies, which is an undergraduate a minor program trying to bridge Asian students and Asian American students. And one of the programs I advocate is exactly this kinds of Asian international students and Asian American students dialogue. So it has been very successful. The first time when I was running, and students are very hungry even for those kinds of dialogue. And that dialogue, the thirst for the communication is actually manifest on both ends for the international students and also for Asian American students. And Asian American students who participated in this dialogue were not limited to Chinese American students. So we have Korean American students, we have Filipino, we have Lao. So we have very diverse Asian American students who are eager to communicate with international students from China and other countries, and Asian international students, I presume in other campuses, certainly on my campus, are largely driven by Chinese international students. So there is some kinds of overlap of similar issues in terms of being immigrant. For Asian Americans, some of them are children of immigrants, in terms of this very common cultural ancestry and similar values, even these challenges or this inability to speak up and speak out in the American classroom. So the issue that facing Asian American students and Chinese international students went certainly beyond language barriers, because for Asian American students, a lot of them, their first language is English. Still, they have this kind of challenge of classroom discussion, speaking up in public, joining a group discussion, and so on and so forth. So I think to really campus provide that kind of space, I would say the civic and academic space for dialogue is so important. It's not just for bridging Asian American students and international students, but really providing that kind of dialogue space for students from diverse backgrounds, especially for those students who have the interest to engage.
Thank you. And does anyone else want to comment on what may or may not have worked on their campus, but very briefly, please? Yong, Professor Chen?
Yeah, very briefly, I totally agree with what Dr. Ma just said. Just a few brief additional comments. on the UCI campus, we created a very successful peer mentor program. So domestic students, sometimes international students, upper class students, they serve as mentors and working with each of them working with 5 to 7 freshmen, international students, right? And so that has been hugely successful. And then another thing that we have tried to do at the campus level, and this is something that I worked on in my role as the faculty director of the international students program, okay, is to try to change the climate of the campus. Okay, so we organized the faculty international student networks, and we also every year we did an international student week. Okay, a series of events every year, introducing students to different services, from ranging from the international center to the writing center, and then introducing domestic students to international students. We also try to help our faculty, staff, and TAs better understand our international students. So we run workshops for those colleagues on topics like how to pronounce Chinese names. Right. Yeah.
Always a perennial challenge. Let's stop there. And let me just say, I don't think we can emphasize enough that personal touch and trying to get people together with their peers. And with one of our audience, Janet Schanberg, asked if any of the schools had tried to match international students with families, not necessarily to live with the family, but just to have a family that is looking out for you, invites you to the home for holidays or special things and takes you out, and how well that has worked for American students studying in Europe. And my experience at George Mason was that was also a very powerful thing, that bringing students to families for Thanksgiving and other events sometimes formed long-lasting and even life-changing relationships. Okay, next topic, and I'm going to throw this one to Frank, but it's really open to anybody. We talked a lot about the Trump administration and some of their actions, and they were very, very critical of American universities. They said American universities were not standing up to China and were naive and didn't understand the threats that were on their campus. And George, your school had a special experience when in December 2020, Secretary of State Pompeo came, and I think a lot of universities really stood up and kind of pushed back and said, no, international students are by and large, some of the most valuable people on our campus. So I think a lot of universities took measures that weren't widely known, and I just wondered how it affected Georgia Tech when you had this very high-profile administration visitor come and talk about specifically a lot about China and the threats on your campus.
Yeah, no, great question. I think this is gets into a lot of really, really important principles here, and so I'll try to be brief on a couple of them. But certainly, when Pompeo asked to come visit, we had a pretty good idea of his perspective and how he would express that when he came to visit. And certainly, I mean, you've heard from me, that is certainly not our institutional position. And, our actions, speak very loudly in that regard. But, we felt that this was a very, very important issue on probably 3 levels. One is it's an important free speech issue. And we need to model this as universities, that shutting somebody down or refusing to talk to them just because you disagree with what you think they're going to say is very much counter to American values, counter to free speech, certainly counter to the values of the university. And as somebody who has been banned from more than one Chinese campus because of what the campus administrators feared that I might say. I guess I'm sort of particularly sensitive on this point. And I think standing on principle on this is very, very important. I think secondly, listening to people with whom you disagree and having a discussion with them is a critical element in the creation of knowledge, right? This is core to how knowledge is created in the academic enterprise. You have a theory, you challenge it, you beat it up, you criticize it. So having that type of dialogue, I think, is really, really important. And I think modeling that again for our students, for our community was important. Thirdly, we felt that having Secretary Pompeo come to campus had educational value, right? You can like what he is going to say or not like what he is going to say, but he's the Secretary of State, so you're going to have to deal with his views. And he's not the only one that held those views, right? I mean, we see those views continuing to exist out there. So if you're going to be dealing with China or China issues, you better understand that. Like, you can't just stick your head in the sand and pretend that those views don't exist, because they do, and they're going to impact you. So we felt that it was important, on those three levels. But those principles run both ways, right? So for the secretary, the terms were that, the same for everybody, is that you come to our campus, you need to engage in dialogue, right? You need to take questions. You need to be respectful and have a discussion. And I have refused to host at least one cabinet secretary, who shall remain unnamed and the time will not be revealed, but who was not in agreement with those principles. Now, fortunately, so in my 3 years here at Georgia Tech, we've had two secretaries of state. We had Rex Tillerson come and speak on Africa, and we had a very good dialogue, and we had Q&A, and we had a panel with him, and the similar thing with Pompeo. And then most recently, we had CIA Director Burns here. That's what a university should do, is engage in these types of things and be a forum where ideas and different and contradictory ideas are discussed and debated.
Thank you. Sounded like a very interesting exchange. Okay, let's see. I will put one question to Samantha about something I know that you are up to date on, and this comes from me, but also from the audience. So Deborah Seligson from Villanova University asked it this way. She said, how are export controls and other regulatory issues affecting science students in labs? And just if you want to comment anything generally about export controls on the campus.
Yeah, absolutely. I must admit and start by saying that I am not a subject matter expert in export control, but more F&J visa regulations. But I was able to speak with a very close colleague on campus to get her insight on how the current relations are impacting export control. And this was really an area that was also highlighted during the pandemic, especially on my campus, when we were advocating and working with how are we going to, best serve our international students, or students more broadly who were learning online or doing research outside of the U.S. So export control is not new in that regard, has always kind of been there, but really came to the forefront. And it is definitely, from current political standpoint, there's a lot of buzz around this, especially with the CHIPS Act, the restricted party list, the military end user rule. These are things that have not yet impacted our campus in any significant ways, but our export control office is very proactive in working with our faculty and researchers to make sure that they are fully aware of the scope of the work that they're doing and how export control regulations may impact the way that they are conducting their research or collaborating with their colleagues outside the US. Even to the point of you can't ship a laptop anymore. It's getting really into the minutia of that's a standard piece of equipment that you would travel with overseas as you are, going on official university business, or that you may ship a laptop to a colleague, a research colleague at another university in another country. So it's getting very, very nitty gritty, and it's feeling a lot like immigration regulations, where you have multiple layers. You in export control world, you've got the Department of Commerce, that you're looking at. In our world, we have not only Department of Homeland Security, but Department of State, Department of Labor, university policy, in my case, state law. So it's feeling more and more like there are these very intricate layers, and they're also contradictory pieces of information out there that's making it even harder for those working within export control regulations to really continue to advance the research missions of our institutions with very minimal interruptions. So it will be very interesting to see how this continues to transpire and play out. But similar to how we are looking at, looking to Australia and the documents coming out of their government with the Chinese University Defense Tracker and different things on with the presidential proclamation side. Export controls also, kind of utilizing those same documents and really leaning on kind of guidance documents out of Australia rather than our own government to help to make sense of how we're going to move forward with this. So it's very interesting, but if you would like to speak with a subject matter expert, my colleague did offer her assistance and her expertise. So I have to give her a shout out here as well. So thank you.
So maybe someone who needs to know more can contact you for that. So we have a couple of very interesting questions from the audience that I want to put out there, even though they're a little bit beyond the scope of most of the presentations today. So one of them is from Professor Fu at Beijing Foreign Studies University, and she is asking about Chinese American scientists on our campuses who have been victims of the China Initiative and caught up in an effort to prove that they have engaged in wrongdoing. In most of cases, the wrongdoing ended up being minor bureaucratic issues rather than any espionage. There were so few cases that involved espionage that it just discredited the initiative, and it's been ended, as we discussed. So her question was, what are your institutions doing to protect these scientists on your campus and researchers, or how can we protect them? And let me just say that there was a very disturbing report that came out today. Karen, you may have access to this. I guess it's going to be published tomorrow. By the American Association, Asian American Scholars Forum, saying that a number of Chinese scientists trained in the United States have been voluntarily electing to end their affiliation with their U.S. university and to return to China and affiliate there. And they have a record of 1,400 Chinese scientists doing so, a big jump in the past year. So anyway, can anyone comment on what institutions are doing generally or at your institution to try to deal with protecting scientists and their research?
Yeah, I'm happy to
Yeah.
answer. Oh,
Okay,
sorry.
Frank, and then Karen, go ahead.
Okay, yeah, just very, very quickly. I think two things. I mean, one is just engagement, with them, and we've had lots of conversations, and from senior leadership, from the provost, from the executive vice president of research, letting them know that we're supporting them. We want them to be successful, and then the tangible thing is making sure that we have a good compliance regime in place, right? So a lot of these issues, conflict of interest and disclosure things, you can easily get yourself in trouble just because you don't know what you're supposed to do, or you don't understand what your reporting requirements are for various different things. And so making sure that you have a good research administration support structure for faculty. So what I tell people is we want to make it very easy for people to do the right thing and very hard for them to do the wrong thing. And so putting in place that type of compliance regime is I think one of the most important things that universities can do.
Thank you. That's definitely what I keep hearing. Karen?
I mean, I think one of the things that this has really, unfortunate incident has really kind of exposed is the extent to which kind of the rules were not necessarily clear. Now, part of that was that they were shifting, and things that would have been perfectly acceptable a couple of years ago were suddenly getting people in crosshairs. Beyond that, I think there's going to need to be much more sort of close collaboration between the groups of faculty, between the research, enterprise, the research administrators, but also the international administrators who have kind of these relationships, who help facilitate the important partnerships with China. I mean, I think a couple of the things, I mean, this new report that Madeline mentioned is very disturbing, but what is really disturbing is it builds on a number of other just kind of troubling signs about the potential chilling effect that both the China initiative itself had, but then kind of the environment that it fostered. And so, I think there's real worry. Will Chinese American or scientists of Chinese or Asian descent continue to apply for federal funding if they do not feel safe? What's going to happen to the pipeline for students, not just from China, frankly, but from internationally? And as a number of people indicated, those students are a very important lifeblood, particularly in the sciences. The American Physical Society did a survey at the end of last year, which suggested that a great number of graduate students, including those who were from China, but also those who are not Chinese but are international, were having serious doubts about whether or not they should continue with their academic careers here in the United States. And when you look at the numbers of scientists or graduate students rather who come for studies and stay, as many of our panelists have, it's a critical loss if they don't do that. And so I think setting the rules of the road, universities are going to need to be much more proactive than perhaps they had been in the past, with talking and advocating and educating and collaborating to set those rules with the federal government. But it's also, I think, being more supportive on campus. I mean, one development just very quickly that I think has been important is on a number of campuses, associations of scholars of Chinese or Asian descent who can be kind of a voice, so that it's not just the individual researcher or academic kind of feeling in the crosshairs, but rather they're coming to administrators and saying, we want to speak with one voice and raise both issues and concerns.
Yeah, so clearer rules and communities of support are critical. And, this was a pretty predictable result of what happened in the last few years. And I just hope that we have turned a corner now and are going to deal with this in a much more rational way. I'm afraid we're pretty much out of time, so I'm going to start wrapping up, and we have some closing remarks as well. So let me say that you've all been really shared a lot of interesting things about your campus. I really appreciate it. I feel a little bit hopeful about what's happening at the university level. after hearing that. And I think we may all need to buckle up and be prepared for a little bit of a bumpy ride for the next few months as we get through some big political events, the U.S. midterm elections, the Chinese 20th Party Congress starting October 16th, where both things are going to kind of raise tensions and the war of words. But in the long run, the education sector has some positive trends that I think we're beginning to restore some normalcy and undo some of the excesses that may have happened and unfortunate situations for Chinese students in the United States. Most analysts are saying, while the numbers may not go back to what they were, they're likely to still be fairly strong just because there's still a strong demand for U.S. educational opportunities in China. And we trust that those Chinese that are coming are going to experience a welcoming environment when they get here. So on that note, for closing remarks, I would like to introduce Min Fan, who's the executive director of the U.S. Heartland China Association, and who exemplifies the benefits of international education, both to individuals and to our country. So thank you for joining us tonight, and over to you, Min.
Thank you, Madeline, and also thank you for the U.S. China Education Trust and the Carter Center for your partnership. And thank you all the speakers for really sharing insight on this topic that's very close to my heart. It's actually just about a little over a year ago, I landed in Pudong International Airport on August 1st. And I was shocked to see, through all the glass partitions, separate incoming and a regular traveler, and a very long winding line of Chinese students, with their backpacks and push carts full of suitcases, many of them with their relatives around them. They were waiting for a flight. So very long line. It was only later that day in the quarantine hotel, I learned that they were already waiting for a charter flight that would take them to Hong Kong. Then from there, they would come to the United States. On that day, the United States had opened the door for international students to come back to campus. And so every one of the students, just like me and many of the panelists earlier than them, or even earlier ones, were in a long history of students want to come here, learn. They have their goals, ambitions, but again, unlike our early generation, they come at a very tricky time, as all the panelists shared. But I do think that we are potentially looking at them being one of the most visible collateral damage of this deteriorating U.S.-China relationship. But I think the damage is much broader. We are just now reckoning with that. But again, it's not so bad. When I landed in China, my friends asking me, "Oh, my kids really want to go, even though we told them don't go. It's a disaster zone in the United States. There's a pandemic." But then I have friends say, "Hey, I really want my kids to get out there," but they felt like they have everything they need in China. So it's really interesting that this Chinese student that coming here is really part of China that's here. If you think we need a window to China, we need a bridge to China, they are here. So I really thank everyone for the conversation. I do think that, as Governor Holden always say, keep opening the door for the young people, because it's only through them, I think a better understanding between two countries can be accomplished. So with that, thank you very much, and really appreciate everyone. And we hope let's work together and then to limit the collateral damage.
Thank you, everybody. Good night.
Good night.